animal in its right mind, I don't think, would go into an environment where it could neither operate nor likely survive. And yet humans have the kind of brain and the kind of emotional and spiritual imperative that can override this sense of instinctual survival and take themselves into places that put them at peril. Humans have always had this taste, this drive to explore, and our next speaker, Joe MacInnis, is going to come out and tell us a little bit about his investigation into what it is that makes for the right stuff. Joe's been on our stage many times before. In fact, he is our good luck charm. And a IdeaCity without Joe would be like, I don't know, the year the swallows didn't come back to Capistrano, or the year the monkeys left Gibraltar. Joe MacInnis always has something new to say, and this year it's about why people go 50 miles up, or in his case, 5 miles down. Joe.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses. When you're 3 miles down inside the crew cabin of a research submarine, and the pressure is measured in millions of kilograms, it's cold, it's dark, help is hours away, sometimes a question comes to mind. And that question is, what's it like to be an astronaut? What's it like to be out there 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, orbiting the Earth at 28,000 kilometers per hour? And if you have a PhD in fear, like I do, a second question comes to mind, and that is, how do these individuals handle the life-threatening risks? Because astronauts use the ocean and deep pools to practice for the weightlessness of space, I've had the good fortune to meet many of them, and they are the first to tell you that there are very striking similarities between the deep ocean and outer space. Both are lethal environments. Both require advanced life support systems to exist and survive and work. And both require more than a shot glass of, as you just saw, of courage and commitment. So the idea I'd like to explore for the next few minutes is a concept called the right stuff. This is the term you have read, I'm sure, Tom Wolfe's book. It sold more than 2 million copies. This is the term that he defined in that book. It was based really on the first 7 astronauts, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Gus Grissom, and the others. And so I looked at it and I asked myself the question. It was written about the first 7 astronauts in the 1960s. How has it changed? We've gone to the moon several times. We've had more than 100 shuttle flight missions. So has this concept changed over the period of time? And if so, how? It's important to me for another reason, and that is that some of the big issues that we're dealing with and you've heard about on this stage, from transnational terrorism to global warming, are going to require something like the right stuff to resolve. In 1962, Scott Carpenter became the second American to orbit the Earth. In Aurora 7, he made 3 orbits, and as some of you may remember, during his re-entry back towards splashdown in the Atlantic, Mission Control lost voice contact. For over 40 minutes, no one knew where Scott Carpenter was, whether he was alive or dead. What we now know is that a glitch in the horizon scanner in that very tiny spacecraft caused him to overshoot the landing site by 250 miles. Very close call. I met Scott 3 years later. He had retired from the astronaut program. He was working with the United States Navy Sea Lab program. He had just spent 3 weeks in an undersea station off the coast of California, working with the Navy, and I was there as a young physician scientist, very interested in human performance in high-risk environments, specifically the ocean. I met Scott, we became friends, we dove together in the Arctic. He came on one of my expeditions, and we dove together in the Pacific, and we've been friends ever since. About 2 months ago, I went to see him and have lunch with him at his home south of the Cape in Florida. And we talked about the right stuff and what it was like in the 1960s. And as I looked into those deep blue eyes of his, the words of Tom Wolfe came to mind. And Tom Wolfe wrote this about the right stuff, I paraphrase. He said, "The world was divided into those who had it and those who did not. Among those who had it, the subject was never named or ever talked about. The quality included manly courage and involved the concept that a man could climb into a piece of hurtling machinery, put his hide on the line, and go up to the outer edge of the sky and have the moxie, the experience, the reflexes, the coolness to bring it back at the last yawning moment and to repeat this thick adrenaline moment the next day, and the next." And as Wolfe said, there was something about it that was ancient, primordial, and irresistible. The right stuff meant knowing that you could be killed in an instant. It meant never, ever exposing the seams of your psyche to a psychologist. Part of its essential DNA was a kind of wacky, high-five sense of humor. In 1969, I was assigned by the Toronto Telegram to go to the Cape to write a story about Apollo 11 and its liftoff to the moon. And I can remember standing there and feeling the ground shake and looking at this enormous white rocket. And keep in mind, this thing was more than 30 stories high. It contained enough explosive firepower equivalent to an atomic bomb. And I knew that Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins were the absolute pinnacle of the righteous stuff. 4 days later, when Aldrin and Armstrong were in that very tiny two-person spacecraft coming over the moon, this is what it looked like. When they were less than 1,000 feet over the surface of the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin noticed that the flight computer in the spacecraft Eagle was going to land them in a boulder field. And the boulders were the size of Volkswagen and would have sheared off the legs of that very fragile landing craft. Armstrong stepped in and he took over manual control and he began to fly over one hazardous site, and then another, and then another. Lights started flashing, abort alarms went off, and the fuel levels went critical. As Aldrin read out fuel consumption and altitude, Armstrong's heart rate went into triple digits. Finally, he was able to land in what we now know as Tranquility Base. Both men were breathing like racehorses. They had 20 seconds. Last January, thanks to Moses and to Mark, I was with Buzz Aldrin at a fundraiser for the Waterkeeper Alliance. We were in Banff. We were skiing together. I had my camera. And I asked Buzz if he would step outside and tell me what it was like to face the Apollo challenge at that moment and what it was like to be standing on the moon. This is what he told me.
The Apollo program certainly was a big challenge to the nation. The Russian space business had been leading us from Sputnik to Yuri Gagarin, and before we had even flown anyone in orbit, we challenged ourselves and our country to put a man on the moon, bring him back safely. I like that last phrase, especially coming back safely. Well, standing on the moon, you know, there are two of us, plus Mike Collins in orbit. Neil and I on the surface, it was just so inspiring to think that just the three of us were there and everybody else was back there on the surface of the earth, many of them paying attention to us. And here we were, further away, and what we had to do to get back. Such a sort of an eerie but awe-inspiring feeling. The moon is a magnificent place for humans to have visited and to go back and make use of, but it's a very desolate place too. And those were the words that I used, magnificent desolation. So now our challenge is to end up the space shuttle program, finish the space station just as the best that we can with our limited missions, and then retire the orbiter so that we can start flying Orion. That's the name of the spacecraft. That's going to look a little bit like Apollo, but it's got many, many more new modern technologies inside. And it'll be taking 4 people to the moon, and they'll be staying for maybe a week, the first few missions, but then it'll extend up to 6 months, and then we'll establish a permanent base. Now, why are we going to the moon? We're going to the moon so we can learn how to live off the land and learn the procedures to be able to support really long duration missions that will go to the asteroids perhaps first, and then to the moons of Mars, and finally landing on the surface of Mars.
In about 6 weeks, August the 7th exactly, Dr. Dave Williams, who graced this stage just 4 years ago, Canadian shuttle astronaut, is going back into space for his 2nd mission. And during that period of time, he's going to spend 13 days at the station, and he's going to make 3 spacewalks and help with the construction of the station. What that means is he's going to spend 19 hours hanging by his bootstraps, orbiting the Earth at 28,000 kilometers an hour. I met Dave about 6 years ago when he was in an undersea station off the coast of Florida. He and 3 other NASA astronauts were living underwater, preparing for future space missions. And since that time, I've gone to Houston, I've watched Dave train, I've filmed him as he climbs into his spacesuit and practices his weightlessness work underwater at the Houston NBL pool. In 1980, Dave was a physician here in Toronto with a dream. He wanted to go and be an astronaut. In 1990, he was accepted into the astronaut program. And in 1998, he flew his first mission, STS-90. It's called Neurolab. He was chief scientist, study of the central nervous system in the weightlessness of space. And NASA was so impressed with Dave that they assigned him to a next 2nd mission. It's called STS-18. Here's how he describes it.
I think STS-118 is going to be a really exciting mission with everything working well on the launch schedule. I'll be doing a first spacewalk. And on the first spacewalk, we're going to be installing one of the outboard starboard elements of the space station to enable us to attach the solar panels back inside the space station to transfer a lot of cargo over to the space station. And of course, we're bringing Clay Anderson, one of the space station astronauts, up to the space station. Our 2nd spacewalk, we're changing out one of the gyros that we use to stabilize the space station. 3rd spacewalk, working on some communications equipment, and then finishing off with 4 spacewalks, a bunch of educational outreach experiments and things, and then some other science experiments. When we do a spacewalk, typically we have 2 spacewalkers outside at a time, and we'll be rotating through. So for the first 2 spacewalks, Rick Mastracchio and I will be doing them, and then Clay Anderson and Rick will be doing the 3rd spacewalk, and the 4th spacewalk, Clay and I will be doing that. For this mission, our training has been a little bit less than for some of the previous missions in the past. Our minimum training ratio is 7 training runs for each spacewalk that we're going to be doing. So if a spacewalk lasts 6 hours, and we'll spend roughly 42 hours in the water training on 7 different runs that spacewalk. And for our first 2 spacewalks, we're right down in our minimum training run. For our 4th spacewalk, in fact, we're still waiting to find out what some of the tasks are going to be. We have only 2 more training runs left for that spacewalk. It's just a great experience working underwater. The mock-up at the space station right now that we're using at the NBL is very flight-like, because we've got the long central truss element, and of course we come up the airlock and head out to the starboard side, go right out to the end, and then we'll be attaching that 5th element on. Any mission brings a wide range of training challenges. For me, the most dramatic challenge for this one has been training for the spacewalks. Doing a spacewalk is very physically demanding, and the type of conditioning you need is not just aerobic conditioning, you need upper body strength and endurance. And kind of the rock climber's physique is really the optimum model for a spacewalker, someone who's got strength and yet the upper arm endurance to be able to spend 6 hours moving back and forth, holding on to pieces of hardware that could weigh up to 1,200 pounds. What's really exciting now is we're looking at having humans staying in space for much longer periods of time and truly looking at extending our capability to have humans in space longer, but sending them farther as well. You know, in the beginning of the space program, we were simply answering, can we do this? Can we send humans out into space and bring them back? Then the question was, could we send humans to work successfully on the moon and have them come back? But those first lunar missions were quite short duration compared to what we're envisioning in the future. And then what we've learned over the last 20, 30 years or so is how to keep humans in space longer, looking at all the different means of helping humans adapt to living in those environments. And now we're looking forward to transitioning from the space station back to the moon. And
if you look behind the words, beyond the modesty, you see today's version of the right stuff. There's the moxie, the experience, the reflexes, the discipline, the determination, the exquisite teamwork that is so important, and that wonderful sense of humor. You know, if you hang around these guys long enough, you very quickly learn that the jokes and the insults that they trade between themselves really carry their deep affection, even love that they have for each other. But like Scott and John Glenn and Wally and the rest and every other astronaut since that time, Dave and his mates have constructed an elaborate emotional heat shield to protect them from the daily stresses and the life-threatening risks. And there's a huge list of those risks, ranging from loss of oxygen to catastrophic suit failure to an impact from a micrometeoroid. Like everyone in this audience, Dave and his teammates are haunted by the final images of 2 previous missions.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last.
Roger,
The one thing that the Mercury 7 astronauts did not have to deal with was a multiple death accident. As you all know, when Challenger and Columbia left the sky, 14 men and women were consumed in the flames and the fireballs. What you might not know, but Dave and his mates are acutely aware of, is that when Challenger blew up, the crew was not killed instantly. Protected by the crew cabin, they heard the thunder, they felt the explosion, and for long, agonizing seconds, they saw the Earth spinning up to crush them. So the right stuff is different, but parts of it are the same. A first ever career is now a full-time profession. One man riding a rocket has become 7 men and women flying a reusable space plane. And 2 years of preparation are turned into 10 years of very, very intensive training. Here's a glimpse of the future. The one thing about exploration in extreme environments, whether it's the deep ocean or outer space, is uncertainty. But I think there is one thing I say with great humility and with certainty, and that is it won't just be new rocket engines that take us to the moon and allow us to put those historic boot prints in the red dust of the surface of Mars. It will be tomorrow's high-octane version of the right stuff. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.